So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV Podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the e-mobility revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
We're joined today by Jeremie Bernardin, Director of Electric Vehicle Training and Innovation at Integrated Automotive Experience. Jeremie has spent over a decade on the front lines of EV advocacy and education, from volunteering with the Electric Vehicle Association of Atlantic Canada to now helping automakers and dealers navigate the EV transition through immersive training and marketing. Jeremie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So let's talk about your journey, how you got your start in the EV world from your personal passion to eventually your professional path.
Yeah, it's been an interesting road. I studied sustainability and geography, and I ended up in the automotive sector, I think out of passion, out of luck. And in 2010, I was in charge of a pre-production tour with Mercedes-Benz with electric vehicles in 2010. And we were doing some training and we're doing a lot of test drives with the public from coast to coast. It was a big national program. And that's where, things really lined up for me in my career, kind of really, I honed into that sector. And then I've spent the next, the next 15 years from government funded programs on education and awareness to startups with dealerships, selling electric vehicles and servicing them. And now I develop and deliver a lot of training programs for manufacturers across Canada and in the United States.
You're officially OG to be working in this space since 2010. So kudos to you on that. Why don't we talk also about your volunteer work and your consumer advocacy through working through the Electric Vehicle Association of Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, well, I'm not originally from Atlantic Canada. And when I moved here about 9 years ago, there's so little going on. I got a few people together and we co-founded this association that covers the 4 Atlantic provinces. And the idea there was to get a larger coverage, to have a louder voice and to support these different regions and to bring in a lot more community and services and to be able to, I guess, have a louder voice and to be able to accelerate the transition to electrified transportation or sustainable transportation. And it's been a lot of fun. And through that, we've been able to leverage those types of volunteer programs to then have funded programs where they're a lot more structured and there's employees and there's meaningful, large scale impact. But it all starts with passion and it starts with volunteering. And that's how it all started 9 years ago.
Wonderful. So right now you're working with Integrated Automotive Experience and you're really addressing the training gap, right? So why don't you talk to us about why that matters and what most automakers and dealers still misunderstand about EV customers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robin. So Integrated Automotive Experience, they've been around for a very long time. They're a highly specialized automotive agency, and they work with the OEMs across the country. And they do a lot of things like launching a new product, doing a lot of, engagement with clients through brand activation. So test drives, events at shopping malls or at specific areas, specific events. They do a lot of the marketing programs and some really unique and innovative programs that they run. And, I wear the electric vehicle hat side of things with the organization. But what we do essentially is we really help them bridge some of those gaps. And I like the saying, you don't know what you don't know. And when we do programs, we'll often do programs for dealership staff right across the country, because that's where there's one of the largest gaps. We'll also do programs with head office staff, because even though they have, I'd say maybe a little bit more knowledge and access to resources, they don't have the same visibility and understanding of the space that a highly specialized agency like ours does when we get to interact with clients from across the industry. And essentially, I think my true expertise is really understanding the customer experience and where the gaps are. And I've given this example a couple of times, but imagine buying an electric vehicle. There's all of these hurdles. You have to figure out charging, whether you live in the city and you don't have home charging, you have to figure out how to fit that in your lifestyle, or you have the ability to charge at home, but you have to now buy a charger and install it. And how much is that going to cost? And how far can I go? And how much does this car cost? And then after you've gone through all of that and you've gone over those fears and you've purchased an electric vehicle, and 6 months later, you get a letter in the mail or an email inviting you to book your first oil change, right? How does that customer feel? Right?
Bad experience.
Exactly. I'm confused.
Well, you would feel disenfranchised. You'd feel like you'd have less, perhaps brand loyalty towards either that dealership or that brand. And fundamentally right now in the electric vehicle sector, I'd say geopolitics aside, I mean, that could be a whole episode. We could talk about that, right? But
Yeah.
And maybe we will.
we probably should, yeah. If we look at brand loyalty and we look at how consumers are more open to changing brands or looking at specific products, then their experience with that brand is so important. So that's a quick little example on getting that email or a letter. But there's a whole variety, and maybe we can dive into that a bit later, a variety of examples of little things that can really make an impact in helping a customer stay within that brand, feel a bit more loyal, feel more optimistic and aligned with that brand, with their electrified products, whether they have them right now or if they're shortly coming. But we essentially help the manufacturer understand where those gaps are and how to optimize a lot of those customer touch points.
And I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but I wonder if you would talk about the kind of emotional side of buying an EV, right? For someone who maybe comes to a dealership of a particular brand they've been brand loyal to before, they're kind of like EV curious, we sometimes say. Like, how do you help guide the dealers, the manufacturers, and helping those kind of EV curious to like push them over to the, environmentally sustainable side of cars?
Well, I guess I should start by saying the environmental and sustainable side of things is not the biggest driving factor for converting somebody to electric, right? So
Oh, for
it's
sure.
the technology piece, the convenience, the cutting edge, and also the joy of driving it. And it's so critical to have potential customers test drive, getting behind the wheel. And that's where brand activations are absolutely crucial to get new clients, right? When we're looking at capturing a new market, that's really, really key. But when we're looking at how to engage with those customers, I want to drill down on one specific example. So if we look at the service side of things, it's an often highly neglected side of things. So essentially, a quick little statistic, it costs 1/8 of the cost to retain a customer than to acquire a new one, just in general in the industry. A service advisor interacts with 3 to 4 times more people per day than somebody who's in sales. They just see a lot of
Oh,
people.
for sure.
And that touch point, right? That's that person that they're communicating with isn't necessarily ready to buy right now. They're in a 3-year lease. They're in for an oil change. They're just waiting around, and they may ask a small innocent question. Hey, I heard these batteries really don't last long, right? Maybe you're in Michigan. Wow, these winters and this snowstorm, an EV wouldn't work here, right? Like that's crazy, right? They might have some myths or misconceptions. And if that service advisor has not had great training, doesn't have a good understanding, and when I say understanding, I don't mean just of that model, that specific EV from that manufacturer, because typically manufacturers do a pretty good job when they do training for that specific model that they sell. But when it comes to understanding the entire ownership experience, I think there's pretty large gaps across the industry. And having that interaction where they're able to either correct the client or build excitement. And you mentioned, Scott, emotions earlier. There's some interesting statistics where 63% of people will remember stories where only 5% will recall statistics alone. So remembering, people remember how they feel. And
Mhm.
if the person who they're engaging with has a lot of confidence, enthusiasm, positivity, and is really portraying either the current model or upcoming model in a very positive light, that is a direct correlation with, a strengthened brand loyalty, right? So how do they connect with the customer? How do they communicate? And what knowledge do they share? And fundamentally, being seen as the experts, right? At the dealership, the dealership
Mhm.
staff, being regarded as the expert is key. And when we start breaking down by generation, the different shoppers and buyers, right? And it's not fair to just completely generalize because some, adopt technology faster than some within the same generation. But, if we look at Gen X and boomers, they have a great relationship with dealerships where there's a lot of trust. And if they're losing that trust, if they're not seeing them as the experts anymore, and they're saying, whoa, I don't think that person knows what they're talking about, that's eroding that loyalty, not just towards that brand or not just towards that dealership, but towards the entire brand. So my whole point is arming them with the right tools, resources, knowledge to be able to provide that type of experience that drives that is really the right thing to do with the long-term game, right? And sometimes in dealerships, I've owned dealerships, there's a huge pressure and focus on a 30-day cycle, right? End of month
Yeah,
quotas,
yeah, yeah.
push cars out the door. And if they can sell a gas car easier, they're going to focus on that. But there really needs to be a lot of effort, often coming from the manufacturer, to help arm all of those staff with the proper resources for the long-term game.
Jeremy, you had mentioned the oil change letter that it goes out after X amount of months, but that brings up a really good point here, right? So there's two sides to this coin. There's the consumer side and what gets them over the hump. But your part of your job is also to not just train, but also convince the sales team that this is the right thing to do. This is going to benefit their bottom line, while at the same time they're realizing this is, I think, why so many of the legacy manufacturers and the dealer networks were like, I'm making money off of service. I'm making money off of those oil changes that brings people in for the upsell. And I'm going to lose that with EVs, less parts, less service. So what kind of resistance? Because I feel like the front lines, the salespeople and the service managers, like you said here, they need to be trained better, but they have to buy in, right? So what typical resistance are you kind of seeing from them, and how are you overcoming those obstacles?
Yeah, great question. And I guess it's really important to identify that there's different separated levels here. So there's the manufacturer that has their long-term goals. They have their whole line of products coming up. They want their market share. They're planning ahead, way ahead of time. Then the dealerships are separate, right? In Europe, there may be an agency model. In North America, we have different owners, and they're looking at profitability. They're looking at their fixed operations, right? Their service centers, and as a huge source of revenue. So there's a lot of resistance there. There's a lot of pain points. And if there isn't, let's say, an embrace of this new wave of technology and this change, then it creates a bit of a snowball effect. And if they're not really putting the right people in the vehicles, they're trying to sell them quickly, they're not identifying who the proper right match is, who essentially qualifying the customer properly, then that creates a world of pain, especially if they're not setting expectations. So that's where it gets really painful, and it gets a bit of a snowball where the customers are upset. The sales team says, wow, this is such a painful experience. And in my experience, I was general sales manager at our dealerships. And essentially, it took 4 to 10 times longer per customer to make a sale with an electric than with
Yikes.
That's significant.
Huge. When you think of that's how they make money, right? It's by sales.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the amount of money they make per sale can be lower because it can be based on the gross of the vehicle, how much profit there is in it. And depending on the manufacturer, there may be not as much profit in an EV. That I'm generalizing, and it's not like that for everybody, but it's not the most incentivizing mechanism. So there's resistance on multiple levels, right? And change is hard. Change is hard for many people. And when we look at those that do really well, so if you look at California, you look in Quebec or British Columbia in Canada, where there's some dealerships that'll have embraced it, they'll be known for this, and then the word gets around. And what's a little bit different, and this is where I can bring a bit of perspective with the Electric Vehicle Association, is especially in areas that don't have the highest penetration of electric vehicles, word gets around. There's a community. One person gets an EV, their neighbors are going to ask what their experience was like, what that brand is like. And there's a lot of studies that talk about this. And it's the same thing for solar. One neighbor gets solar, the whole houses near it, that cluster has a way higher statistical chance of having solar in the next X amount of years. Same thing for electric vehicles, right? A lot of people will say, you can drive this in winter, and have all this myth busting. Certain areas we're seeing, maybe a little bit less of that because they're becoming a lot more ubiquitous. California, again, as an example, where there's a lot more of them, but in smaller regions, there's still that effect. It's making sure that they're delivering a great experience is critical. And I'm going back to this point of brand loyalty is lower than ever. So having that great experience where they're talking to more and more people than ever before, and people are inquiring, kind of over delivering and becoming that leader, people will come to them. So it's, one of the primary objectives that I have when I'm doing training is to build up enthusiasm, right? Confidence.
Yeah.
Confidence sells, right? So if somebody's confident, enthusiastic, they say, you know what, Rob, I think you're going to love this electric vehicle. I think your wife, you expressed that your wife has a couple hesitations around this and around charging, around road trip planning. Let me help you out. Let me show you both how to plan a road trip. This is the software. These are the websites. It's a lot easier than you think. And here's some tips and tricks. And I guarantee you, Rob, you're going to love this, right? And if you have that enthusiasm, that confidence, your customers, as they become EV customers, will really start looking at you as the trusted experts.
Well, Jeremy, you have that confidence. It's infectious. I can feel it here right now. But once again, when you're speaking to the sales teams, are they buying in?
Yeah. So we have some great statistics from our programs because we do a lot of quizzing afterwards in benchmarking and seeing, okay, well, first of all, are they learning something new? Are they retaining that knowledge? So it's not just about delivering knowledge and training. It's about ensuring that they're able to use it and using neuroscience-based principles and information retention and micro learnings and gamification and all that fun stuff. But at the end of the day, it's what I was saying was that enthusiasm piece. And part of that is also demystifying and breaking down all of their roadblocks. And this is where it's so challenging for a manufacturer to come up with their own kind of training program where they're saying, I'm going to endorse this or these studies. Whereas when we have an independent agency like ours, I can say, hey, here's 4 studies out of Europe, and here's 2 studies out of North America. This is your lifetime or life cycle emissions assessment. So an electric vehicle after 21,000 miles or 13,000 miles, depending where you are and what vehicles you're comparing it against, you are now in a carbon positive state, meaning you've paid off the carbon debt of having built vehicle with a battery and electric motors, which we can all agree on. It takes more energy and which pollutes more, has more CO2 in manufacturing an EV, but it is so misunderstood how much pollution a car emits by running it.
Yeah.
Show those studies. And if you're breaking that and helping build that confidence and being able to talk about, okay, well, how can an EV be just as environmentally friendly as a gasoline vehicle when the electricity comes 100% from coal? That's where there's huge amount of misconception. It comes down to thermal efficiency and, taking a unit of energy, how much of that gets turned into turning the wheels, pushing the car forwards. And that's where electric vehicles are so efficient and gas vehicles are so inefficient. And being able to show visually and help them understand and grasp and say, oh, now I get it. And even though they may not be experts in that space, they now have confidence and they have an ability to answer their customers and ideally provide resources to them to back that up.
So you're really drilling down into that level of detail with these types of trainings that you're giving to the dealers specifically, because it's interesting to me thinking about yeah, sure, there's going to be somebody who comes in and says, well, it's all the energy comes from coal, and you have an answer for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it really depends because we can curate our programs. I can deliver a 25-minute training session and, we have very little time to dive in. I can deliver a full day training session where we go over the vehicle, comparative analysis against the competition and finding equivalencies or finding ways to make that vehicle look wonderful and conveying that to the customer. There's also different levels for, let's say, an EV expert within the dealership where we can look at even more advanced things like, okay, so your homeowner wants to install an EV charger, but the electrician had said they need a whole new electrical panel and it's going to cost $6,000 to be able to install an EV charger. That's a huge barrier when somebody wants a 2-year lease on an EV.
Yeah, no.
Right?
Yeah.
A great deal. $119 a month for a lease, but now it's $6,000 for your electrical upgrade. And that's where the, in-house experts can say, actually, there's all of these different tools that you can use. You can use a load sensing mechanism where your charger only turns on if your electrical panel is not fully utilized. Right? So you don't have to get a new electrical panel. It just means if you're cooking, washing the dishes with the dishwasher, you've got the dryer going, you got the heating going, well, then your charger's not going to turn on. But at night, when all of those things aren't running, there's plenty of capacity on your panel. That's when your EV charger turns on. And at that point, there is no upgrading your panel. So little things like that. We won't train all of every staff in the dealership to understand that, but having key experts within the store to be able to overcome those barriers and to have resources for them is really critical if you want to really push the needle and provide solutions and to help more people get into their models that are offered that are electrified.
This is why I love
Super interesting.
technology. I love these answers here. I mean, if I was sitting here at the dealership and you're talking to me, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. That's amazing here how something that I thought was a barrier, immediately you can show, no, we can do this. Here's the technology. Here's the right answer. Without that, you're gonna be like, this cost me 6 grand more. Forget it. I'm just gonna get a nice vehicle instead and just save my money and save myself the hassle of dealing with all of this. It's really good stuff. But Jeremy, timing is everything right now, and I kind of feel like everything's kind of coming together in the right place, right time for what you're doing right now, at Integrative Automotive. But you did own dealerships. You said you were the general manager. This was a dealership that was exclusively selling EVs, correct? Talk to us more about that, and talk to us more about the trajectory of trying to sell EVs several years ago.
Yeah, so this started in Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia is a very, small, almost like rural province. Not that many people live here, and definitely not at the forefront of EV adoption. So kind of an interesting place to have a startup. But it started one step before that, where I essentially went to the government and said, we should really have an electric vehicle education and outreach campaign. And I got a $1 million grant over 2 years, and we launched this kind of road show that went around the province, around the state, and got people behind the wheel. And bums in seats is the KPI. It is the metric to track because it is so critical to have them experience firsthand getting behind the wheel. But I realized the barrier wasn't just getting behind the wheel. The barrier was just access to EVs. And the way it works for the majority of manufacturers is you can allocate different products in different regions. And if you look in the United States, electrified products, an example will be, in past years, the Mazda MX-30, which was an electrified, smaller EV, only offered in California. So they will allocate production runs to certain regions. And in Canada, it wasn't really allocated to Nova Scotia or Atlantic Canada. So myself and two other business partners, we started a pre-owned electric vehicle dealership that had all makes and models, and we did full servicing of all electric vehicles. And we grew quite quickly. We had multiple locations in multiple provinces, and we were acquired quite early on, and we grew to 4 provinces, so 4 different regions. And at one point, we had the largest inventory of electric vehicles and pre-owned electric vehicles in North America. It was a pretty interesting, intense experience. And we had 3 core pillars, right? Sales, service, and education. Because we really understood that we needed to be able to make information digestible. And like I mentioned, 4 to 10 times longer to make a sale. What programs can we develop to help shorten that and make our lives easier? And this is what I'm teaching now with dealerships and manufacturers on how to not repeat everything all the time. Pre-record a short little video of a salesperson charging the vehicle, right, at a public fast charging station. How do you pay for it? Which apps do you need an app? Can it be paid by credit card? Is there a gap between connecting the vehicle and the charging session starting, right? There's a communication, there's a handshake. Sometimes it takes 15 to 30 seconds. And if that person is just waiting and trying to disconnect right away because it's not starting. So instead of having to explain that time and again with your customers, why not make some videos? And when the customer purchases the vehicle, you send them a link of lots of resources, right? A guide. And we're working with different manufacturers now to create kind of welcome to your new vehicle guide and different types of resources, even tools to help sell the car. So this is a calculator for your cost savings or your emission savings, or this is a list of tools for planning road trips or how to charge at home, and really being able to, make life easier for those that are customer facing. And all of those resources and ideas were originated from, all of the mistakes I've made and that we made with that dealership and all the challenges we faced. And trust me, there was lots. There was lots of learnings that now we can share, more broadly.
Well, I'm just curious, once again, was it the timing thing? This sounds like obviously you're taking all that experience and you're utilizing that right now to train other dealerships. But I'm just curious if the used EV exclusive dealership model, if that's a thing. It sounds like a great business model. It obviously didn't work when you tried to implement it several years ago. But is that the future of dealerships today?
That's a really good question. You can't have multiple brands under one roof that are new, right? Your franchise
it has to be used. Yeah.
Yeah, so it has to be used. So on the used side, yes, that can work. It depends what region and what level of adoption there is. It depends on multiple factors. It's also, I think it's fair to say the used market has been a tremendous roller coaster since COVID. With used prices going up and down in a rather drastic way, which can be very challenging to navigate as a business, right? In terms of owning
for sure.
inventory and costs and profit margins. As to the future, I think any dealership that has a lot more resources to help the customer is going to win more and faster than others, knowing how to price the vehicle, but also really building that element of trust. So being able to give the right information, being able to provide the right resources to build that trust and that confidence in that brand of your store is critical. And I think that's what's going to really lead to success in the future.
Yeah, and I guess part of the reason why I brought this up is because on social media, I'm following, they're an EV, I think it's sales and service center. It might be more primarily service. They're out west in Utah. They seem to be expanding. They seem to be from their posts, it seems like it's a really growing business. All right, so the sales side's a roller coaster, no matter whether you're EVs or ICE vehicles. But is there a business on the service side, or are EVs just so service free that there's almost no money to be made there anyway?
Yeah, no, there's definitely money to be made for sure. And if you just look at some, statistics, you're looking at between 50 and 40% less work on electric vehicles than on gasoline cars. And this is, Consumer Reports, or Ford USA has, released some data around the Ford Lightning when it was released. And so there's a lot less maintenance for sure. So the dealership has to adapt and find different ways to bring in revenue. And if you look, all you have to do is look to Europe. How's Norway adapting? How's Sweden adapting, right? They have
Yeah.
huge portions of their new car sales are electric, right? I think Norway last year, 95% of new car sales were electric. If we're looking at Sweden and Denmark, you're looking at, over 50, 60, 65% of new car sales. So those dealerships are having to adapt, and they're finding different ways to still remain profitable. They're bringing in used parts. They're finding ways to have collision centers at the dealership. They're starting to bring in business for, cracked windshields and windshield replacements. Let's not go to whatever auto glass shop. We're going back to the dealership. They're going back to owning a lot larger market share of the tire market, right? So why go elsewhere? EVs do go through tires, more so than a conventional vehicle, mostly for multiple factors. But I think primarily is the go pedal is quite enjoyable and is really fun. There's no big unnerving noise, so it's a bit easier to just kind of get on it. And there's so much torque with these electric vehicles. They can, unless customers buy tires that are specific to EVs. And again, that's where they can find that expertise and to be really that trusted resource when they start having more specific products that they can sell. But back to your question on, is there any money to be made? I believe there's still money to be made there for sure. There's different ways to be innovative with it. It's not going to change right away in the sense of just because you've sold 50% of your new cars are electric, there's still 95% of the cars on the road, or 90% or 82% of the cars that are gas. They'll still need to be serviced. But there's one really critical part here is independent service shops. There's tons of them. There's way more independent service shops than there are dealerships by like a really large factor. Now, if we look at customer retention that stay at the dealership, they service their car. If we look at a graph, it drops like a stone as soon as the warranty period is over. It makes sense, right? Where you're like, well,
There's a reason why the dealership, because you feel like you're going to get raked over the coals when you bring it in for service, and they're going to continue to upsell you and find problems. So yeah, generally speaking, my personal experience, and I feel this is the same with others, that as soon as the car is done with the warranty, you start looking for your local shop instead.
yeah, and they have, the dealerships will often have higher quality parts. They'll be fixing the car completely, making sure it lasts a really long time. Whereas some independent service shops, I'm generalizing here, I'm just saying some, they may be more willing to say, yeah, let's just fix this for now and help you just stay on the road because that's what you need right now. But, long term, you'll need to address this. That's where that car may not last as long as getting everything fixed, right the first time.
Yes.
But my point here with the independent service shops is it goes back to trust, right? So if, the jack point, if you put the jack at the wrong place under the vehicle and you dent the battery, all it takes is 3 millimeters dent in the battery
Yeah.
case to write off the battery pack on a Tesla, right? And for most EVs, 3 millimeters. And the pack casing is not made out of cardboard, right? It's not going to dent easily, but if it had something sharp and it punched it in, it can write off the car. So there's an element of trust there. And like I said earlier, it's a big barrier to buy an electric vehicle. And in most cases, an electric vehicle is a more expensive purchase than their previous vehicle. So it's a bigger leap. They kind of want to baby this car. They're a little bit more worried. So they'll go with a place that they trust more. So in the EV transition, dealerships have a great opportunity to retain customers longer than just the warranty duration of the vehicle. So sure, there's less servicing opportunities on electric vehicles than on a gasoline vehicle, but there's an opportunity to keep the customer longer, to keep coming back. They still need to get in alignment. They still need to get their whole braking system inspected and make sure it's well lubricated and works really well. And if anything, that needs to happen. It's more crucial on EV because you'll use your brakes less. And if you don't get it cleaned and, rust builds up, then you'll end up having to replace those components faster than on a gas car in some cases, not because of wearing it out, but because of rust or improper wear. But my point is, if they keep coming back to the dealership over a longer period of time past the warranty period, there's more opportunities to upsell them, get them into a different vehicle. They're just in the waiting room. They see another used model or see a brand new model, and it's a great opportunity to keep them within that brand. So, this is a long-winded answer to say there's lots of opportunities and that dealerships shouldn't be afraid of this transition. And again, it's understanding that can help build a bit more enthusiasm and a bit more optimism and buy-in, which really helps that, it helps them in the long run with that customer experience.
It's interesting here as we're discussing all of this right now and bringing in the used cars and the service opportunities and the battery packs, which you'd mentioned there. Now, while a 3 millimeter dent in a battery pack will render it useless, ironically here, we're going to have Scott Case from Recurrent on the show. And ironically now, it seems like battery packs, everyone just assumed, they're so expensive to replace. This is another one of those sort of propaganda, misinformation campaigns that you can't trust the batteries. And as it turns out, it's looking like these batteries are lasting way longer than people expected. So typically, the battery will outlast the car, which means these batteries now tend to potentially have a second life. And on that note, Jeremie, you'd mentioned something when we were having a pre-tape conversation about an i3 battery that's come into your hands and your plans with it. So talk to us more about the second life of batteries after these cars are done with them.
Yeah, so I have some BMW i3 batteries that I'm putting into a lawnmower tractor conversion. This is more of a
Oh,
passion and something fun that I've been working on. And, I have some friends and we convert boats to electric as well. We have a Chevy Volt powered pontoon that's 120 horsepower that, for a pontoon, it flies. And, we're
that's
building all.
wild.
Oh yeah, and this tractor won't be as wild, but it'll be quiet and it'll be nice. I can mow the lawn at night and not bother the neighbors. But you know, the second life application again, it goes back to misconceptions by both dealerships and consumers of, wow, hold on. I've got to mine minerals. How can EVs be more sustainable? What are you talking about? I've seen photos on Facebook. There's a big mine. It's going to take X amount of tons of, of manganese, of lithium, of cobalt, and you have to then process that and create battery pack. EVs can't be sustainable. You hear this over and over and over again. And again, it goes back to the same point of, as soon as you have that crossover point of driving it, it has a net positive carbon impact compared to a gasoline vehicle. Batteries, you're completely right. Batteries last a lot longer than people expected. One of my closest friends here in Nova Scotia, he's got over 300,000 miles on his original battery pack.
Wow.
Yeah. Original battery pack. And he, drives it every day. He drives, I think, 60, 65 miles a day. And it's been phenomenal for him. So batteries last a lot longer. It's not like your cell phone, right? Your cell phone, they try to make the smallest phone possible, and it has no thermal management, no ability to heat or cool the battery on a phone. Whereas in a vehicle, there's a lot of that. Plus there's software where they're saying, okay, this is the battery. Well, I'm only going to be able to use, let's say the middle part of it, the top 10% and the bottom 10%, I'm not going to utilize. So then by staying within that, the battery doesn't wear out in the same way, can last a really long time. Batteries, first of all, on average, according to several studies, and Scott will talk about that as well, it'll last longer than the average vehicle chassis in North America. So that's the first point. Second point is, Yes, batteries are getting a lot less expensive. If somebody does have an issue with a battery, which does happen on some older models, particularly, there's starting to be a pre-owned market for this. And you got to think of it like if you own a 12-year-old gasoline vehicle and I don't know, your head gasket blows or your timing chain goes and you bend the valves, you're going to just put another used engine. You're not going to buy a brand new engine for $17,000 installed. You're going to find, the dealership, the service center, or even your independent shop can find a used engine for two, three, four, five, $6,000, plus installation. So it'll be a fraction of the cost. Well, EVs were so new, there weren't used batteries around, but now we're starting to see it. And think of, cars that are written off because of hail. Like, the whole body is
Yeah.
dent. How's that battery? It's immaculate. It's perfect, right? And we know batteries last a long time. Maybe the vehicle has 25,000 miles. That is a wonderful battery that a shop can then purchase and install it at a fraction of the cost of new. But back to your other point you mentioned earlier, second life applications. Let's say the vehicle has had 300,000 miles on it. I'm not necessarily going to want to install that battery. It'll have had some degradation of the battery, right? Your state of health, how much capacity in that battery will have reduced to the point where, let's say it's 80% or 85% of its original capacity. I don't want that anymore. I want a battery that's a lot closer to, let's say, 94% of its original capacity. So if you're looking at kind of the next phase of our transition in our society towards cleaner energy, stationary storage for batteries is growing around the
Mhm.
world. Tesla, the mega packs, the working with utilities. There's really interesting research happening. Actually, in my backyard, figuratively, in Dalhousie University, out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, has a phenomenal research lab where they're testing and they're putting it to use, where they're looking at EV batteries of different makes and models and even different voltages and how they can work together and being able to work. So imagine you have solar or wind, right? We want to have a lot more of that. But those are intermittent energy sources, meaning the wind can stop blowing. There could be a big cloud and it starts raining. Well, if 100% of our homes and our society is powered by renewables that are intermittent, we're not going to be okay with the power going out. So we need to have a sort of buffer and battery bank. And that's where having these large scale facilities with a lot of these pre-owned batteries, it can be one of the solutions. There's a lot of new batteries that are coming at a really low cost. That's also a great solution for this. But there's a lot of different applications. I'll give you a concrete example that I love to share. There's a company out of Quebec, out of Trois-Rivières, called Enginex. They're taking Chevy Bolt motors. They're converting the little tractors at airports that are pulling the planes and the luggages, right? And they're
Yeah.
converting those 100% to electric, high torque, a perfect use case. And they're putting used batteries and used motors in them. So it's that second life application where we're not just throwing these batteries in the landfill. And even after this second life application, they're highly, highly, highly recyclable. There's a lot of valuable minerals and resources in them where you can recycle a huge percentage of that battery. And now we're working in a circular economy where we don't need to dig for minerals in the same way, because now we can start reusing, a lot of that aluminum, that copper, that manganese, the cobalt, the lithium. We're able to putting that back into the manufacturing cycle and getting a new battery pack out of it.
Amazing. So just a bit of a transition here. Speaking about North America and the difference between the EV journey in Canada and the EV journey in the US, how do those differ? And then what are the lessons that you think that we can learn from each other?
Interesting question. Many similarities, but they're regional. So if we look at British Columbia and Quebec, there'll be a lot of alignments with the CARB states. So the states that have aligned with the California Air Resource Board and all of their mandates for a certain percentage of electric vehicles. So those, is it 11 or 13 states, have a lot higher percentage of adoption for electric vehicles. And if we start comparing to regions like Quebec and British Columbia with very high adoption rates, very, very high, there's a lot of similarities there. But if you look at Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, there's a lot of similarities there too, in terms of larger barriers to higher adoption, having less dense urban centers and a lot more rural areas that perhaps have less coverage. But fundamentally, there's very similar challenges, and it comes down to education, awareness, the same, learnings of these programs that we have in Canada. We have the exact same type of information that we share in the United States. We just, for those programs, we don't use kilometers, we use miles. You know what I mean? But it's the same type of information on understanding, where their electricity comes from, what that pollution is, and what's the actual truth here for an electric vehicle and what its impact is.
Amazing.
Let me talk about one point that I kind of want to share. And I think the first step for a lot of dealerships and manufacturers when they're wondering what they can do, that they're saying they're recognizing that they have some challenges and they want to find some solutions. I think the lowest barrier to entry is an audit, right? It's an audit of the materials and the processes and the resources. And we typically do this with manufacturers, and we'll say, let us look at the programs that you have. Of course, we sign NDAs and we don't share, specific details from any other competitors, but we'll analyze and look at all of their processes and resources and procedures and say, these are all of the areas where you have a great opportunity to have a really meaningful impact and to do it in a very cost-effective way. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to redesign everything. We can just find ways to tweak. We can add certain things. We can create different resources and really help move that needle to create more enthusiasm, more confidence, more welcoming environment for Scott, as you mentioned it, the EV curious, right? The next customers that are coming in this area and in this era of brand loyalty that's a lot more fickle. It is so critical, and there's a lot of cost-effective tools out there and resources, but it kind of starts, the first easy step is just to have an analysis of their state of programs, and then to find those opportunities for them. I'd say that's often the easiest way to get really meaningful impact.
I really do believe that what you're doing here is you're the linchpin for widespread EV adoption, because I just have to reiterate that without the sales team's buy-in, when we walk into, I happen to be shopping for an EV right now. I'm bringing my wife along, and of course, I'm the host of the Urban EV podcast. I know my EVs, I know my stuff. I can walk in there with confidence. I know the drill. If my wife were to walk in by herself, she would not be asking the questions that I'd be asking. And it's interesting to see certain dealerships, how they respond. And like you said, there's that confidence. And certain times I've spoken to salespeople, I'm like, all right, they know their stuff. And I have to actually stop and say, okay, I appreciate this. I already know it, but I like where you're going with this. And there's others that are giving me answers which are kind of willy-nilly, and they're not really fully well-versed in EVs. And I think anyone can smell that a mile away. Most people can anyway. And as soon as you feel that, you lose the confidence. All right, we'll just go with the path of least resistance, something I already know. So what you're doing, I think, here really is going to help move the needle. And I hope that you manage to speak to every dealership in North America to kind of get them on board. Because when that happens, that's going to also really accelerate this EV revolution that we're on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly hope if anybody that works in a dealership wants to reach out at, Integrated Automotive Experience, we're happy to work with anybody, dealerships or manufacturers. But you're 100% right. There's a big need for this, especially if they want to have that market share and to be part of that future for all of these OEMs that they have very ambitious electrified plans. And I'd say right now in the news and the media, it sounds like things are cooling off, but manufacturers have such a long-term horizon and their product cycles and planning ahead. There's a lot of electric products that are coming down the line, and some manufacturers are a bit more vocal about their current initiatives and their enthusiasm towards it. But everybody is behind the screen. Everyone's running and they're getting all their ducks in a row to have a really large market share and to fight for that. So we're excited to be supporting them and reaching those goals.
And Jeremie, that just about does it for time on today's show. But can you do me a favor and share with the audience at home your contact information and let them know how they can reach Integrative Automotive?
Yeah, absolutely. So integratedauto.com, that's the website for our organization. You can definitely reach out to us there. And for myself, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name, Jeremie Bernardin, and Jeremie is spelled the Francophone way, Jeremie. Yeah, so Jeremie Bernardin, find me. Happy to have a conversation with anybody who's interested.
And we'll be sure to leave a link in the show notes below. All right, so that's it for this episode of the Urban EV Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, leave us a review and share the show with a friend or colleague. The road to sustainability starts at the plug, and that's why we're here. We will see you all next week with a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.